Max's teeth gleamed in the darkness, his growl vibrating through James Anderson's bedroom like distant thunder. The German shepherd's hackles stood rigid, eyes fixed on something invisible beside the nightstand. This wasn't the loyal companion who'd slept peacefully at the foot of James's bed for 7 years. This was something primal, threatening. "Max! Down, boy!" Sarah's voice cracked as she flipped on the lights, her flannel robe clutched tight at her throat. Michael rushed in behind her, his military training evident in his stance. James sat frozen against his headboard, night sweat glistening on his hollow cheeks, the medals from Vietnam hanging on the wall behind him, now just reminders of strength he no longer possessed. "Get that dog out of here," Sarah commanded as Max's growl intensified, his focus unwavering. What was causing this devoted service animal to threaten the very man he once protected? And why did it happen only at night? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Anderson family home sat nestled among oak trees at the edge of Millfield, Virginia, a modest 2-story colonial that had seen better days. The white paint peeled in places, revealing decades of history beneath, much like the man who now occupied its spare bedroom. Captain James Anderson had once commanded 60 men through the jungles of Vietnam with unwavering authority. Now, at 62, his tall frame had grown gaunt, his once steady hands betrayed by tremors that worsened with each passing month. James had moved in with his sister Sarah after the combination of medical bills and a meager military pension cost him his own home in Richmond. The transition from decorated Marine to dependent brother had corroded his sense of self. Each morning he would polish his service medals while watching the neighborhood through his window, a ritual that anchored him to the man he once was. Sarah Miller had put her career as a hospice nurse on hold to care for her brother. At 55, the premature gray in her auburn hair testified to years spent putting others first. Widowed young when her first husband's heart failed, she had found a second chance at happiness with Michael. But lately, the strain of caregiving had etched permanent worry lines between her brows. She loved her brother fiercely, but resentment and exhaustion had begun to seep into that love like water into cracked foundations. "He's getting worse, not better," she often whispered to Michael late at night when she thought James couldn't hear through the thin walls. "The VA keeps pushing back his appointments. What are we supposed to do until December?" Michael Miller moved through life with the quiet confidence of a man who understood animals better than people. At 58, his broad shoulders still carried the posture of his years working with the county's K-9 unit. His weathered face softened only when he spoke about dogs, especially Max. He had rescued the German Shepherd 4 years ago after the military deemed the dog unsuitable for service, despite exceptional training. The official papers cited excessive protective instincts as the reason for discharge. "Some dogs just care too much," Michael had explained when bringing Max home. "The military wants machines. Max has a heart." Max had seamlessly integrated into their lives, becoming especially attached to James. The German Shepherd would lie beside James during his worst PTSD episodes, his steady presence a comfort when nightmares transported the veteran back to warfare. Neighbors often commented on the dignified pair walking slowly through the neighborhood each morning, the limping soldier and his attentive companion. Dr. Frank Wilson lived across the street in a Victorian home surrounded by meticulously maintained rose gardens. At 70, the retired entomologist kept largely to himself, though he always nodded respectfully when he saw James. Few in the neighborhood knew about his collection of rare insects or the medals similar to James's that he kept locked in a drawer. Fewer still knew about the debt he carried, a debt to the Anderson family that had shaped the last 40 years of his life. The delicate balance of their interwoven lives had been functioning, if not thriving, until 3 nights ago, when Max first bared his teeth at the man he had sworn to protect. Sarah's hands trembled as she poured coffee the morning after Max's first nighttime incident. Outside, autumn leaves spiraled down from the maple trees, their golden hues belying the tension that had settled over the household. Through the kitchen window she could see Max in the backyard, behaving as though nothing had happened, tail wagging as Michael tossed a worn tennis ball across the lawn. "He seems perfectly normal now," Sarah said, placing a mug in front of James, who sat hunched at the kitchen table. His untouched pills formed a small, colorful mountain beside his plate of barely touched scrambled eggs. "Dogs don't just turn aggressive for no reason," James replied, his voice carrying the gravel of too many cigarettes during his tour of duty. "Especially not Max." James winced as he reached for his coffee, the movement pulling at muscles still tense from the previous night's terror. At 2:17 a.m. precisely, he'd awakened to find Max standing beside his bed, teeth bared, a low growl emanating from deep in his throat. The dog's normally gentle eyes had been fixed on him with an intensity that transported James straight back to nights in the jungle when danger lurked in every shadow. Sarah had heard the commotion from her bedroom across the hall. She'd rushed in to find her brother pressed against his headboard, pale and sweating, while Max continued his threatening posture despite Michael's repeated commands. "I've been reading about canine cognitive dysfunction," Sarah said now, sliding her iPad across the table to show James an article. "It's like dementia in older dogs. Max is 7 now, and German Shepherds can develop it early." James pushed the iPad away without looking at it. "There's nothing wrong with Max's mind." Michael entered through the back door, bringing with him the crisp scent of October air. Max trotted at his heels, looking the picture of canine health and stability. The shepherd approached James cautiously, as if aware of the tension his behavior had caused, and gently laid his head on the veteran's knee. "See?" James said, scratching behind Max's ears. "He's the same as always." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Until tonight, when he decides to go for your throat. That's enough." Michael's tone was firm but quiet, the same voice he'd used training police dogs for 15 years. "I've checked him over completely. No signs of pain, no physical abnormalities that would trigger aggression." Sarah slammed her coffee mug down, sloshing the dark liquid onto the faded tablecloth. "So we just wait until he actually hurts someone. James is vulnerable enough without—" "I'm sitting right here," James interrupted, his military authority momentarily reasserting itself. "And I'm not an invalid." The ensuing silence was broken by the mechanical chime of the grandfather clock in the living room, a family heirloom that had survived 3 generations of Andersons, unlike James's marriage, which had crumbled under the weight of his PTSD decades ago. Michael placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "The VA sent another letter yesterday." James's expression hardened. "Let me guess. Appointment pushed back again?" Sarah nodded, her anger deflating into resignation. "December 18th now, and they're still reviewing your appeal for the increased disability rating. 8 months waiting for them to acknowledge what every doctor has already confirmed," James muttered. "Maybe I'll be dead before they make up their minds. Save everyone some trouble." "Don't talk like that," Sarah said sharply, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Caring for James while fighting an indifferent bureaucracy had worn her thin, like fabric stretched beyond its capacity. The morning light caught the silver in Michael's beard as he leaned against the counter. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But his platitude rang hollow in the kitchen that had become a war room of medical bills, appeal forms, and prescription bottles. The latest electricity bill lay open on the counter, the past due amount circled in Sarah's neat handwriting. Later that afternoon, James sat on the back porch watching as golden light filtered through the oak trees. Max lay at his feet, chin resting on paws, a picture of contentment that made last night's behavior seem like a bad dream. "You'd never hurt me, would you, boy?" James murmured, his gnarled fingers finding the spot behind Max's ear that always made the dog's eyes close in bliss. Their ritual had been the same for years. Each morning, weather permitting, they would walk together through the neighborhood, James's halting gait matched perfectly by Max's patient stride. The dog never pulled ahead despite his capacity for speed, seeming to understand that his human needed both the exercise and the dignity of moving under his own power. Last winter, when James had fallen in the bathroom and couldn't reach the phone, it was Max who had alerted Sarah with persistent barking. The dog had refused to leave James's side during the 6 hours they waited for an ambulance. The rural county's emergency services stretched thin by a multi-car pileup on the interstate. "You saved my life," James whispered, remembering how Max had lain beside him on the cold tile, providing warmth as shock set in. "So what changed last night?" As if in answer, Max's ears perked up at the sound of footsteps approaching from the street. Dr. Frank Wilson appeared around the corner of the house, a container of homemade stew in his weathered hands. "Hope I'm not intruding," the older man said, his voice carrying the slight raspiness of a former smoker. "Sarah mentioned at the community meeting that you've been under the weather. My late wife's recipe always worked miracles." James nodded in greeting, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Unlike most visitors, Wilson never looked at him with pity or forced cheer. There was something in the retired professor's eyes that recognized James as an equal, a man who had seen his share of the world's darkness. Max surprised both men by rising suddenly, his posture alert but not aggressive. He approached Wilson and sniffed intently at the man's pant legs, paying particular attention to his shoes. "Curious fellow," Wilson commented, setting down the stew to offer his hand to Max. "Always the inspector." "He's been acting strange lately," James admitted, something in Wilson's manner inviting confidence. "Got aggressive in my bedroom last night. Never seen anything like it from him." Wilson's expression shifted subtly, a momentary calculation passing behind his eyes. "Animals sense things we don't. My research specialty was on sensory perception in insects. Some can detect chemical changes parts per billion." James raised an eyebrow. "You think Max is smelling something?" "Perhaps." Wilson's gaze drifted toward James's bedroom window. "Dogs have been known to detect illness, changes in blood chemistry, even certain environmental toxins." Before James could press further, Michael appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Wilson didn't expect to see you today." His tone was friendly but carried an undercurrent of territorial protection. "Just dropping off some sustenance," Wilson replied, standing with the careful movements of a man managing arthritic joints. "I should be getting back. Those crosswords won't solve themselves." As Wilson departed, Michael sat in the vacated chair. "Nice guy, but something about him has always seemed off." James shrugged. "He's a scientist." "They're all a little odd." Michael watched Max, who had returned to his position at James's feet but remained alert, eyes tracking Wilson's retreat across the street. "Sarah's still upset about last night. I gathered. She wants Max to sleep in the garage until we figure out what's going on." James's jaw tightened. "This is your house. I'm just a guest." "That's not true, and you know it." Michael leaned forward, elbows on knees. "This is your home for as long as you need it, but Sarah is scared, and honestly so am I. If something happened to you on our watch—" The unfinished sentence hung between them, the implication that James was someone to be watched over, protected, managed like a child or an invalid. It scraped against his pride like sandpaper. "Fine," James conceded finally. "But just for tonight. If he's normal, he comes back inside tomorrow." Michael nodded, relief evident in the relaxing of his shoulders. "Deal." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, James couldn't shake the feeling that Max had been trying to tell him something important that the humans in his life were too blind or deaf to understand. That night, Sarah set up the air mattress in James's room, insisting on staying nearby, just in case. She didn't specify what "in case" might entail, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. In case James had a PTSD episode, in case he fell, in case he needed his medication adjusted. The litany of his vulnerabilities remained unspoken but ever present. From the garage, they could hear Max's occasional whine, a sound so plaintive it made James's chest ache. "He'll be fine," Sarah assured, though whether she was comforting James or herself remained unclear. "It's just until we can get him checked by a vet." James lay back on his pillow, staring at the ceiling where water stains formed continents and oceans, a map of neglect that matched his feelings about the VA system. "He's not sick, Sarah." "Then what's your explanation?" She sat on the edge of the air mattress, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through her phone, researching dog behavior long after she should have been asleep. James had no answer that would satisfy her. How could he explain the instant recognition he'd felt when Max growled, the same hyper-vigilance he himself experienced when danger lurked nearby? It wasn't aggression he'd seen in Max's eyes. It was warning. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We're both still here in the morning. You'll see there's nothing to worry about." Sarah switched off her phone, the sudden darkness making the room feel larger and emptier. "I just don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice small in the darkness. "Not after everything." The everything encompassed decades, their parents' early deaths, James's combat tours, her first husband's heart attack, the endless battles with the VA for proper care. Through it all, the Anderson siblings had remained each other's constants, even when James's PTSD made him withdraw from the rest of the world. "You won't lose me," he promised, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. At 62, with his health failing and resources dwindling, James knew his remaining time was measured in years, not decades. But he wouldn't be taken down by his own dog. Of that much, at least, he was certain. As Sarah's breathing deepened into sleep, James remained awake, listening to the distant sounds of Max pacing in the garage. Something had changed in his environment, something that had triggered Max's protective instincts. And despite what Sarah thought, James trusted the dog's instincts over human perception any day of the week. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" he whispered into the darkness, receiving only silence in return. The second night proved worse than the first. James had finally drifted into a fitful sleep around midnight when the sound of frantic scratching at his bedroom door jolted him awake. Outside in the hallway, Max whined and growled, somehow having escaped from the garage. Sarah sat up on her air mattress, hair wild, eyes wide with alarm. "How did he get in?" she hissed, fumbling for the lamp switch. Before James could answer, the door burst open. Max stood in the threshold, hackles raised, teeth bared, but his aggressive stance wasn't directed at James. Instead, the German shepherd positioned himself between James's bed and the far wall, his growl deepening to a sound that raised the hair on James's arms. "Michael!" Sarah called, her voice cracking with fear. "He's in here again!" Michael appeared seconds later in rumpled pajamas, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in the scene. "I locked the garage door, I swear." "He must have figured out the latch." Max ignored them all, his focus entirely on the wall beside James's dresser. The dog took one step forward, then another, his body rigid with tension. "Get him out of here." Sarah was fully awake now, standing on her air mattress as if the few inches of elevation might protect her. "James, move away from him." But James remained still, watching Max with newfound curiosity. "He's not threatening me," he said quietly. "Look at where he's focused." Michael approached cautiously, reaching for Max's collar. The moment his fingers made contact, Max let out a sharp bark. Not of aggression, but almost of frustration, as if the humans in the room were being deliberately obtuse. "Something's on that wall," James said, squinting in the dim light. A peculiar itching sensation had begun on his forearm, and when he glanced down, he noticed a spreading rash of small red bumps. Sarah saw it too. "What is that?" "You didn't have that earlier." Michael finally managed to secure Max's collar, though the dog continued to resist, straining toward the wall with single-minded determination. "I'm taking him back to the garage. I'll make sure he can't get out this time." As Michael dragged the reluctant shepherd from the room, Sarah approached James's arm, her nurse's training taking precedence over her fear. "This looks like some kind of reaction. Are you using a new soap? New laundry detergent?" James shook his head, the itching intensifying. "Nothing's changed." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm calling Dr. Harrington in the morning, and I think—" She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "I think Max needs to stay somewhere else for a while." "What?" James sat up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his bad shoulder. "No, absolutely not. James, be reasonable. He's broken into your room 2 nights in a row, showing aggressive behavior." "What if next time he actually attacks you?" "He won't," James insisted, though the certainty in his voice didn't quite reach his eyes. "He's trying to protect me from something." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "From what? The wall?" Before James could respond, Michael returned, his expression grim. "He's secure now. Double-latch the door and put your old toolbox in front of it for good measure." Sarah turned to her husband, arms crossed. "Michael, we need to talk about finding somewhere for Max to stay until we figure this out." The silence that followed her statement was charged with unspoken tensions. Michael's attachment to Max went beyond typical pet ownership. The shepherd had become his project, his success story after the tragic loss of his canine partner years earlier. "Where exactly do you suggest?" Michael's voice was dangerously quiet. "A kennel? The shelter?" "You know what happens to German shepherds with behavioral issues at county shelters." "Don't be dramatic," Sarah snapped, though they all knew the grim statistics for large dogs surrendered due to aggression. "Maybe your old canine colleague, what was his name? Dave, doesn't he rehabilitate difficult dogs?" "Max doesn't need rehabilitation," Michael insisted, the muscles in his jaw working. "He needs us to figure out what's triggering this behavior." James watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd seen this pattern before, his presence creating friction in his sister's marriage. First financial strain, now Max. How long before Sarah had to choose between her brother and her husband? "It's my fault," James interrupted, drawing both their attention. "I'm the disruption here. Maybe I should be the one to go." Sarah's expression crumpled. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you go?" The question hung painfully in the air, a reminder of James's dependence, his lack of options. His military pension barely covered his medications, let alone independent housing. Without Sarah and Michael, he'd be in a VA facility, or worse. "This is your home," Michael said firmly, the anger in his voice subsiding. "We'll figure out what's going on with Max, I promise." But as they all returned to their beds, the compromise felt temporary at best. In the darkness, James could still hear Max's distant barking from the garage, persistent, urgent, like an alarm no one knew how to shut off. Morning brought a tense ceasefire and unexpected visitors. James sat at the kitchen table, examining the rash on his arm which had spread overnight, now extending from wrist to elbow. The small red bumps had clustered together, forming an irregular pattern that itched relentlessly. Sarah placed a mug of coffee before him, her expression softening at the sight of his discomfort. "I've left a message for Dr. Harrington. Hopefully he can squeeze you in today." "You know he can't," James replied without looking up. "Not without a referral from the VA." The doorbell interrupted what would have been another circular argument about healthcare bureaucracy. Michael answered it, returning moments later with their neighbor Mrs. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher whose property bordered their backyard. "I'm sorry to bother you folks," she began, clutching her cardigan closed despite the mild autumn temperature. "But I wanted to talk to you about your dog." Sarah straightened, instantly defensive. "Has Max done something?" Mrs. Peterson shook her head, her silver bob swinging gently. "Not exactly, but the barking last night, it went on for hours. My grandson is staying with me this week and he couldn't sleep." "We're very sorry," Michael said, his tone contrite but strained. "We're dealing with some unusual behavior from Max right now." The older woman nodded sympathetically. "I understand." Dogs can be sensitive to all sorts of things, but the Homeowners Association has rules about persistent noise disturbances. She paused delicately. "This is actually the second complaint this month." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with his physical condition. The HOA had already cited them once for Sarah's vegetable garden extending beyond the approved dimensions, a small act of rebellion against rules she found pointlessly restrictive. Another violation could mean fines they couldn't afford. "It won't happen again," Sarah assured her, though how she planned to prevent it remained unclear. After Mrs. Peterson left, the kitchen fell into uneasy silence. The unspoken reality hung between them. Another complaint could force a decision about Max none of them wanted to make. "I'll take him to Dave's for an evaluation," Michael conceded finally, the defeat in his voice painful to hear. "Just for a day or two. Maybe he'll see something I'm missing." Sarah squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you. I know how hard this is." James remained silent, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers. Something about the situation felt wrong, pieces that didn't fit together. Max's behavior, his own mysterious rash, the dog's fixation on one specific area of his bedroom. There was a pattern here, if only he could see it clearly. Dave Fletcher's property sat 20 miles outside town, a sprawling 5 acres dedicated to training and rehabilitating working dogs. As Michael's truck crunched up the gravel driveway, Max whined anxiously from the back seat, sensing that this wasn't their usual destination. James had insisted on coming along despite Sarah's concerns about the journey aggravating his condition. The rash had continued to spread, now accompanied by a persistent headache that throbbed behind his right eye. "He'll be in good hands here," Michael said, as much to convince himself as James. "Dave worked with military dogs in Afghanistan. If anyone can figure out what's going on with Max, it's him." Dave met them outside a large barn that had been converted into an indoor training facility. In his 50s, with the lean build of a distance runner, he greeted Michael with the easy camaraderie of old colleagues before turning to James with a respectful nod. "Captain Anderson, it's an honor, sir." James nodded in acknowledgement, slightly taken aback. "You know who I am?" "My older brother served under you in '72, Dave explained. "Tommy Fletcher. Said you were the reason he made it home." The name triggered a cascade of memories. A lanky private with a Tennessee drawl and steady hands under pressure. "Good man. Saved our unit more than once with his radio skills." Dave's expression warmed. "He speaks highly of you. Now let's take a look at this dog of yours." As Michael led Max from the truck, Dave's professional demeanor took over. He observed the German Shepherd's movements, posture, and reactions with clinical precision, occasionally making notes on a small pad. "What exactly has he been doing?" Dave asked, kneeling to allow Max to approach him on the dog's terms. Michael described the nighttime incidents in detail, emphasizing Max's focus on the bedroom wall and lack of actual aggression toward James. Dave listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "Has anything changed in the house recently? Construction? New furniture? Water damage?" James and Michael exchanged glances. "Nothing significant," Michael answered. "The house is old, but it's been stable." Dave scratched behind Max's ears, earning a brief tail wag. German Shepherds have extraordinary sensory capabilities, about 40 times more scent receptors than humans. They can detect things we can't see, smell, or hear. "Like what?" James asked, the pounding in his head momentarily forgotten. "Changes in body chemistry, environmental toxins, structural weaknesses," Dave listed. "During my tour, we had a shepherd who kept alerting on a particular wall in the barracks. Turned out there was an electrical short in the wiring that could have caused a fire." Michael's eyes widened with realization. "You think Max is detecting something in James's room?" "It's possible." Dave stood, brushing dust from his knees. "What's interesting is that you said this behavior only happens at night. That suggests whatever he's detecting either gets stronger then, or he's only able to sense it in quiet, low-light conditions." James rubbed his forehead, trying to process this information through the fog of his headache. "So he's not being aggressive. He's trying to warn us." "That would be my guess," Dave confirmed. "The question is, warning you about what?" The three men fell silent, contemplating the implications. If Max was alerting to a genuine threat, removing him from the house might be putting James in danger. "I'd like to run some tests with Max," Dave said finally. "See how he responds to different stimuli. Might give us a better idea of what he's reacting to. It'll take a few hours." Michael nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Whatever you need." As Dave led Max toward the training barn, the shepherd looked back at James with an intensity that cut through his physical discomfort. In that moment, James was certain of one thing. Max wasn't the threat. He was trying to protect them from one. Sarah was waiting on the porch when they returned, her expression tight with worry. "Dr. Harrington can't see you until next week," she announced as James eased himself out of the truck. "But I spoke to the pharmacist about your rash. She thinks it might be an allergic reaction to one of your medications." James nodded absently, his mind still processing Dave's assessment. "Did Michael tell you? About Max?" "He called," Sarah acknowledged, supporting James's elbow as they climbed the porch steps. His balance had been deteriorating lately, another symptom the VA had yet to properly address. "Dave thinks there might be something in your room." "Something Max can detect, but we can't," James confirmed. "Dave's keeping him overnight for observation, but he's not aggressive, Sarah. He's trying to warn us." Sarah's skepticism was evident, but she kept her doubts to herself as she helped James to the sofa. "Well, whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Right now, I'm more concerned about you. Your color doesn't look good." James couldn't argue with that assessment. The headache had intensified during the drive home, and the rash now burned as well as itched. He felt a bone-deep fatigue that reminded him of the early days of his illness, before proper medication had stabilized his condition. "I'm fine," he lied, a lifetime of military stoicism making the words automatic. "Just tired." Sarah's expression made it clear she wasn't fooled, but she didn't press the issue. "I'll get you some water for your pills. Michael's bringing dinner from that diner you like." As she disappeared into the kitchen, James leaned back against the sofa cushions, closing his eyes against the throbbing in his skull. Without Max's warm presence beside him, the house felt eerily quiet and strangely vulnerable, as if a sentry had abandoned their post. "What are you sensing, boy?" he murmured. "What's in that room that the rest of us can't see?" The question lingered unanswered as the autumn sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the living room. In less than 6 hours, night would fall again, and for the first time in years, James would face the darkness without Max's protective presence. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his mysterious symptoms. The Veterans' Day ceremony in Millfield Park drew a modest crowd, despite the unseasonably warm November morning. James sat uncomfortably in the folding chair Sarah had insisted he use, watching as Boy Scouts distributed small American flags to attendees. He'd refused to sit in the special section reserved for veterans, preferring anonymity to the well-intentioned but often awkward expressions of gratitude from strangers. "You should be up there," Sarah whispered, nodding toward the row of aging men wearing their service caps. "You earned it." James shook his head slightly, wincing as the movement aggravated his persistent headache. "I just want to pay my respects and go home." 3 days had passed since Max's removal to Dave Fletcher's training facility. 3 nights of uninterrupted sleep that somehow left James more exhausted than before. The rash on his arm had spread further, now creeping up his neck in an angry constellation of red bumps. "Doctor?" Harrington's earliest available appointment remained 5 days away. Michael sat on James's other side, his attention divided between the ceremony and his phone, where Dave had promised to send updates about Max's behavior. So far, the reports had been inconclusive. Away from the Anderson home, Max showed no signs of aggression or distress, performing flawlessly in all of Dave's assessment exercises. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced from a small podium decorated with bunting, "please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Colonel Richard Hayes." A tall man in his 70s approached the microphone, his posture still military straight despite his age. James straightened instinctively, recognition flickering across his face. "You know him?" Sarah asked, noticing the change in her brother's demeanor. "Knew of him," James corrected quietly. "He commanded the battalion adjacent to mine in '72, reputation for looking after his men." Rare quality in those days. Colonel Hayes adjusted his glasses and began speaking about sacrifice and duty in a voice weathered by age but still carrying the unmistakable cadence of command. As he spoke, James noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd, Dr. Frank Wilson, his attention fixed not on the speaker but on James himself. When their eyes met, Wilson offered a solemn nod before turning his gaze to the podium. Something about the intensity of the older man's scrutiny made James uneasy, though he couldn't articulate why. The ceremony concluded with taps played by a local high school student, the mournful notes hanging in the autumn air. As people began to disperse, several younger veterans approached James, having recognized him despite his attempt at anonymity. "Captain Anderson?" A man in his 40s extended his hand. "Tim Garner." "My father served under you." Staff Sergeant Lewis Garner. James shook the offered hand, memory supplying the image of a stocky, reliable NCO with a talent for mechanics. "Good man, your father. Saved our unit more than once when the vehicles broke down. He always said the same about you, sir." Garner's expression grew solemn. "He passed last year. VA finally acknowledged the Agent Orange exposure, but too late to help him." James nodded, understanding all too well the bureaucratic delays that could cost lives. "I'm sorry to hear that. Your father deserved better." As more veterans gathered around, sharing connections and memories, Sarah stepped back, watching her brother transform before her eyes. The hunched, pain-riddled man who'd grudgingly attended the ceremony was temporarily replaced by Captain Anderson, back straight, voice clear, eyes alert as he fielded questions and remembered names from decades past. "He needs this," Michael observed quietly, coming to stand beside his wife. "Community, purpose, people who understand what he went through." Sarah leaned against her husband's solid presence. "I know. I just wish it didn't take a ceremony about war to bring him back to life." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael's phone vibrating with an incoming call. "It's Dave," he said, stepping away to answer. Colonel Hayes approached their small group, his eyes finding James immediately. "Captain Anderson, I thought that was you. It's been, what, 40 years?" James stood with effort, offering a respectful nod rather than attempting a salute his arthritic shoulder wouldn't allow. 43, sir. Saigon evacuation? Hell of a time. Hayes's weathered face creased with understanding. Heard you took some hits after coming home. VA giving you the runaround? James's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. You could say that. 40-year battle and counting. Hayes produced a business card from his wallet. Call my office. My aide specializes in expediting stubborn cases. Too many good men getting lost in the system. James accepted the card with carefully concealed surprise. Such offers were rare, especially from senior officers who typically moved in different circles than company-grade officers like himself. As the colonel moved on to greet other veterans, Michael returned, his expression troubled. Dave wants us to come by this afternoon. Says there's something we should see. Dave Fletcher's training facility was quiet when they arrived, most of his staff having departed early for Veterans Day observations. He met them at the entrance to the converted barn, his usual easygoing manner replaced by professional intensity. Thanks for coming, he said, leading them into a large open space with rubber matting covering the floor. Various training apparatus, platforms, tunnels, barriers lined the walls. I've been running Max through a series of scent detection exercises. Max trotted over from a resting area, his entire demeanor brightening at the sight of Michael and James. The shepherd pressed against James's legs, whining softly as if checking on his condition. He's been perfect, Dave continued, retrieving a tablet from a nearby table. Temperament, obedience, scent discrimination, all exceptional. But then I noticed something interesting. He pulled up a video and turned the screen toward them. The footage showed Max in a sterile-looking room, moving methodically past a series of identical containers. This is standard scent detection training, Dave explained. We place different substances in each container and train the dog to alert on specific ones. On screen, Max moved past several containers without interest before stopping abruptly at one, sitting down and staring at it intently, the trained alert position. That container held spider venom, Dave said, his tone careful. Specifically, black widow venom, which we use in police canine training to help dogs identify certain types of illegal substances that contain similar compounds. James and Michael exchanged confused glances. Spider venom? Michael repeated. What does that have to do with Max's behavior at home? Maybe nothing, Dave acknowledged. But his reaction was unusually strong, and it got me thinking about his focus on your bedroom wall. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Black widows are common in Virginia. They like dark, undisturbed spaces, like the spaces behind walls in older homes. James felt a chill despite the warmth of the building. You think there are spiders in my wall? That's what Max has been reacting to? It's a theory, Dave said. Black widows are most active at night, which would explain the timing of Max's behavior. And they're nearly impossible for humans to detect until there's an infestation. Michael's brow furrowed in thought. But why would he suddenly start alerting now? We've had Max for years and the house is even older. Seasonal changes can trigger movement in spider populations, Dave explained. With winter approaching, they may be seeking warmer spots deeper in the walls. Or perhaps there was always a small population that recently expanded. James absently scratched at the rash on his arm, pieces clicking into place. Could a bite cause this? Dave examined the rash with professional interest. It's possible. Black widow bites don't always leave the classic two-puncture mark, especially if you were bitten through clothing or sheets. The symptoms can be subtle at first: rash, headache, muscle pain. Jesus, Michael muttered, and we've been treating it like he's the problem. Dave placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. You couldn't have known. Most people wouldn't make the connection between a dog's behavior and spiders. We need to get back, James said, a new urgency in his voice. If there are venomous spiders in that wall, Sarah's alone with them. The house was quiet when they returned, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the front yard. Sarah's car was missing from the driveway, a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter explaining she'd gone to pick up James's prescription refill and groceries. "Should we wait for her?" Michael asked, hovering uncertainly in the hallway outside James's bedroom. James shook his head, wincing at the movement. "Let's take a look first." No sense worrying her if Dave's theory is wrong. They entered the bedroom cautiously, Max leading the way with alert vigilance. The shepherd moved directly to the wall that had been the focus of his nighttime warnings, sniffing intently along the baseboard. Michael knelt beside him, examining the aged wallpaper for any signs of disturbance. "I don't see anything obvious. Check for small holes or tears," James suggested, staying back to give them room, "or areas where the wallpaper seems to be bubbling." As Michael ran his fingers along the seams of the wallpaper, Max's posture changed, hackles rising, a low growl building in his throat. The sound was identical to the warnings that had so alarmed Sarah in previous nights. "He's definitely reacting to something," Michael confirmed, pulling his hand back, "but I can't see any entry points." James approached slowly, his military training overriding his physical discomfort. "These old houses have all kinds of access points behind the walls, old heating ducts, plumbing roots." He pointed to a small vent near the floor, its metal grate discolored with age. "Start there." Michael retrieved a screwdriver from his pocket toolkit and carefully removed the vent cover. Using his phone's flashlight, he peered into the opening, then jerked back suddenly. "Holy shit," he breathed. "Dave was right." James moved closer, his heart rate accelerating. "Spiders?" "A whole nest of them," Michael confirmed grimly. "Black widows, just like he said. They're all over the inside of that wall cavity." Max's growl deepened, his focus unwavering from the now exposed opening. The message in his behavior was unmistakable. Danger. "We need to call an exterminator," Michael said, carefully replacing the vent cover. "Immediately. This isn't something we can handle ourselves." James nodded, but a troubling thought had formed in his mind. How did Dave know to test Max specifically for spider venom? That's not exactly standard procedure, is it? Michael's hands stilled on the screwdriver. "No," he admitted after a moment. "It's not. But Dave has always had good instincts with dogs." Or someone suggested it to him. James mused. The tactical part of his brain, the part that had kept him and his men alive in hostile territory, suddenly alert. Someone who might have had reason to suspect spiders were involved. Before Michael could respond, the sound of Sarah's car pulling into the driveway interrupted their conversation. Max's ears perked up, but his attention remained fixed on the vent, his body positioned protectively between it and James. "Let's not mention our suspicions to Sarah yet," James said quietly. "Just the spiders. I want to talk to Dr. Wilson first." Michael gave him a questioning look but nodded in agreement. "Your call, Captain." As Sarah's footsteps approached the front door, James placed a grateful hand on Max's solid back. The shepherd had been right all along, standing guard against an enemy the humans couldn't see, protecting his vulnerable charge with single-minded determination. "Good boy," James whispered, a lump forming in his throat. "The best damn soldier in this house." Max leaned into his touch, brown eyes fixed on James with unwavering loyalty, as if to say, "Mission accomplished, sir." Across the street, Dr. Frank Wilson observed the activity at the Anderson home through his living room window. The arrival of the exterminator's van confirmed his suspicions. They had finally discovered the source of Max's behavior. Relief mingled with concern as he watched the professionals in protective gear entering the house. He moved to his study, unlocking the bottom drawer of his desk where a small, weathered box contained his most precious possessions. Medals identical to those James displayed, a faded photograph of two young soldiers arm in arm, and a letter he had written decades ago but never delivered. "They found them, Thomas," he murmured to the photograph. "Your boy is safe. The debt stands." Closing the drawer, Wilson turned to his extensive collection of specimen jars lining the study walls. The Black Widow section was conspicuously empty, one container missing its occupant for the past week. Some debts could never be fully repaid, but perhaps this accidental warning had balanced the scales just a little more. The exterminator's verdict was worse than they had anticipated. The aging walls of the Anderson family home harbored not just a few spiders, but a substantial infestation of black widows that had likely been growing undetected for months. The discovery explained Max's increasingly agitated behavior and potentially James's mysterious symptoms. "These colonies can double in size every few weeks under the right conditions," explained Hank Parsons, the weathered exterminator whose family business had served Millfield for 3 generations. He stood in the driveway with Michael and Sarah, his protective suit unzipped to the waist in the unseasonable November warmth. "The recent drought probably drove them deeper into the structure looking for moisture." "Could they have bitten my brother?" Sarah asked, her nurse's composure barely masking her distress. "He's developed a rash and other symptoms." Parsons nodded grimly. "Entirely possible. Black widow bites don't always leave obvious marks. The venom affects the nervous system, causing pain, rash, headaches, muscle cramping in someone with existing health conditions." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God, we've been treating Max like he was the threat, when he was trying to warn us all along." "That dog knew exactly what he was doing," Parsons confirmed. "Seen it before with good working dogs. They can detect things we can't. Mold, termites, gas leaks. Your Max was performing a service, not showing aggression." Michael's jaw tightened with a mixture of vindication and guilt. "How long will the treatment take?" "We'll need to do a full house fumigation," Parsons replied, removing his protective gloves. "Minimum of 3 days. You'll have to relocate until it's complete. People and pets. Nothing living can stay in the house." Sarah and Michael exchanged worried glances. The cost of even a modest hotel for 3 days would strain their already precarious finances. Between James's medications and the recent furnace repair, their emergency fund was depleted. "We'll figure something out," Michael said, reaching for his wallet to provide a deposit. "The important thing is making the house safe again." Inside, James sat on the living room sofa with Max lying protectively at his feet. The shepherd hadn't left his side since their return from Dave's facility, as if making up for lost time. Despite the throbbing pain in his head and the burning sensation that had spread across his skin, James felt a profound sense of relief. The mystery was solved. Max was vindicated. "You've been promoted," he told the dog quietly, scratching behind his ears. "From sergeant to medical officer, saving my hide again." Max's tail thumped against the floor, his intelligent eyes fixed on James with unwavering attention. For the first time in days, James felt truly safe. Sarah entered, her expression tight with worry. "We need to get you to the emergency room," she announced without preamble. "Black widow venom is serious, James, especially with your compromised immune system." James shook his head slightly, mindful of the pain the movement caused. "The VA won't cover an ER visit without pre-authorization. You know that." "To hell with the VA," Sarah snapped, her patience finally exhausted. "This is potentially life-threatening. We'll figure out the bills later." "With what money?" James countered, gesturing to the exterminator's truck visible through the window. "You've got that to pay for, plus finding somewhere to stay for 3 days. I'm not adding thousands in medical bills to your burden." Sarah's eyes filled with frustrated tears. "So what's your plan?" Just suffer through potential neurotoxin exposure because the government can't get its act together? Before James could respond, Michael intervened with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. Let's call Dr. Harrington again. Explain the emergency. He might be able to see James today and at least assess whether ER care is necessary. The compromise seemed to deflate some of Sarah's urgency. Fine. But if he says go to the ER, we're going. No arguments. James nodded in reluctant agreement. The truth was he felt worse by the hour, the headache now a constant pounding presence, the rash burning like fire against his skin. But decades of military stoicism made admitting weakness nearly impossible, especially when it would burden those he loved. As Sarah retreated to the kitchen to make the call, Michael sat heavily in the armchair across from James. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for doubting Max, for not putting it together sooner. You couldn't have known," James replied, echoing Dave's earlier reassurance. "I'm the one who should be sorry, bringing all this trouble into your home." Michael waved away the apology. "This is your home too, James, for as long as you need it." The simple statement, delivered without qualification or resentment, threatened to unravel James's carefully maintained composure. In the military, he'd known exactly where he stood, his purpose clear, his authority respected. Civilian life had stripped away that certainty, leaving him adrift and dependent in ways that scraped raw against his pride. "Found a cancellation," Sarah announced, returning to the living room with keys in hand. "Dr. Harrington can see you in 30 minutes. Let's go." As James slowly rose from the sofa, using his cane for support, Max stood as well, clearly intending to accompany them. Sarah hesitated, old concerns briefly resurfacing. "He should come," James said firmly. He's earned it." Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the shepherd, standing alert and ready beside her brother. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "He has." Dr. Harrington's office was located in a converted Victorian house near the town square, its waiting room crowded despite the late afternoon hour. The receptionist, recognizing Sarah from her nursing days, immediately ushered them into an examination room. "The doctor will be right with you," she assured them, casting a curious glance at Max before closing the door behind her. James sat stiffly on the examination table, the paper cover crinkling beneath him. His military training had instilled in him a profound distrust of doctors. Too many had dismissed his post-Vietnam symptoms as psychological. Too many had prescribed medications that created more problems than they solved. "Try to relax," Sarah advised, recognizing the tension in his posture. "Dr. Harrington is one of the good ones." As if on cue, the office door opened to admit a tall man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Max sitting calmly beside the examination table. "Well, this is a first," he remarked, closing the door behind him, "though I've heard service dogs can be extremely beneficial for veterans." "He's not officially a service dog," Michael explained, "but he's the reason we're here. He detected black widow spiders in the walls of our home that were likely biting James in his sleep." Dr. Harrington's professional demeanor shifted immediately to alert concern. "Black widow bites? How long ago?" "We're not sure," Sarah admitted. "The symptoms started about 4 days ago: rash, headache, muscle pain. We initially thought it was a medication reaction." The doctor approached James, his movements deliberate and transparent, a technique James recognized as being intended for patients with PTSD or anxiety. "May I examine the rash, Captain Anderson?" James nodded, carefully rolling up his sleeve to reveal the angry red constellation that now covered much of his arm and had begun spreading across his chest. Dr. Harrington's examination was thorough but gentle, his questions precise and focused. He checked James's blood pressure, pupil response, and reflexes with practiced efficiency. "The good news is that most black widow bites, while painful, aren't fatal to adults," he explained, making notes in James's chart. The bad news is that the venom is neurotoxic and can cause significant complications, especially in patients with compromised immune systems or pre-existing conditions. Like me, James concluded flatly. Like you, the doctor confirmed. Your blood pressure is elevated and I'm concerned about potential systemic effects. I'd like to administer antivenom and keep you under observation. Sarah stepped forward anxiously. Does he need to go to the hospital? Dr. Harrington considered the question carefully. Ideally, yes, but given your financial concerns and James's VA situation, we might have an alternative. He turned to James directly. I participate in a veterans health initiative that might cover treatment here in the office, followed by home monitoring. It would mean staying with someone who can check your vital signs regularly and report any changes immediately. He'll be with us, Michael said without hesitation, though we're being fumigated for the next 3 days. So we'll be somewhere else. The uncertainty in his voice revealed their still unsolved housing predicament. Dr. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Let me make a call. I may know someone with a suitable guest house available. He stepped out of the examination room, leaving the family in tense silence. James closed his eyes, the fluorescent lights aggravating his headache. The situation was spiraling beyond his control. Medical procedures, temporary housing, financial concerns all mounting like an enemy force gaining ground. Max pressed against his leg, the dog's warmth and solid presence the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. It's going to be okay, Sarah said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her own doubts. Dr. Harrington returned minutes later, his expression cautiously optimistic. I've spoken with Colonel Hayes. He has a fully equipped guest house on his property that he makes available to veterans in need. It's yours for as long as necessary. James straightened, pride warring with necessity. Colonel Hayes? From the ceremony today? The same, the doctor confirmed. He's a major supporter of veterans' health initiatives in the area. The guest house is specifically designed for veterans with mobility or health issues. The offer was generous, suspiciously so in James's tactically minded opinion. First, the business card with promises of VA intervention, now housing. Such conveniences rarely came without strings attached. That's incredibly kind, Sarah began, relief evident in her voice. Wait, James interrupted. Why would he do this for someone he barely knows? Dr. Harrington's expression softened with understanding. The colonel has his reasons, I'm sure, but right now let's focus on treating those bites. Questions about accommodations can wait until you're stabilized. As the doctor prepared the antivenom injection, James caught Michael's eye. A silent communication passed between them, the kind that only occurs between men who have learned to evaluate threats and opportunities with equal caution. I'll look into Hayes while you're being treated, Michael said quietly. See what's behind the generosity. James nodded gratefully, then winced as the needle entered his arm. Whatever Colonel Hayes's motivations, they would have to wait. The venom coursing through his system demanded immediate attention, a battle on the home front that he couldn't fight alone. Max remained vigilant beside him, brown eyes tracking every movement in the room, standing guard even now. The irony wasn't lost on James. After years of protecting others, he was now the one being protected. By his sister, his brother-in-law, his doctor, and most unexpectedly, by a dog who had seen what no human could. Good boy, he whispered, as the medication began to take effect, dulling the edges of his pain. Stand down, soldier. Mission accomplished. But Max didn't relax his vigilant posture. Whatever instinct had driven him to guard James against invisible threats was still active, still alert. As if the mission wasn't over at all. Colonel Richard Hayes's property sat on 5 acres at the edge of town, a stately colonial home set back from the road behind a screen of ancient oak trees. As Michael's truck crunched up the gravel driveway, James observed the immaculate grounds with a soldier's eye, noting the security cameras discreetly positioned along the perimeter, the motion sensor lights, the clear lines of sight from all windows. "Quite a setup," he murmured, the anti-venom making his tongue feel slightly thick. "The colonel takes security seriously," Michael agreed, parking beside a smaller structure that stood separate from the main house. "Can't say I blame him, given his background." Sarah helped James from the passenger seat, supporting his weight as he navigated the short path to the guest house. Max followed closely, his behavior subdued but alert, still performing his self-appointed guard duty. The guest house proved to be a modern one-level dwelling with wide doorways, grab bars in strategic locations, and other accessible features that spoke to its intended purpose as a recovery space for veterans. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a small private garden, currently ablaze with autumn colors. "This is unexpected," Sarah admitted, taking in the thoughtfully designed space. "It's like a high-end rehabilitation facility." "That's exactly what it is," came a voice from the doorway. Colonel Hayes stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. He wore civilian clothes, pressed khakis, and a button-down shirt, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. "Captain Anderson," he said, nodding respectfully to James. "Dr. Harrington filled me in on your situation. Remarkable story about your dog there." "Always said German Shepherds were the best soldiers in any unit." James acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod, his tactical mind still assessing the situation. "This is very generous, Colonel. I'm not sure why we warrant such accommodation." Hayes's weathered face creased in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in ensuring Vietnam veterans receive the care they earned. Too many of our brothers fell through the cracks when they came home." The explanation was reasonable, even admirable, but James sensed something left unsaid. Before he could probe further, Sarah intervened. "We're extremely grateful, Colonel. The doctor wants James monitored overnight, and with our house being fumigated—" "Say no more," Hayes replied, waving away her explanation. "The place is fully stocked. Food in the fridge, fresh linens, medical supplies in the bathroom cabinet. There's a panic button by the bed that connects directly to emergency services if needed." He handed Michael a small remote. "This controls everything: lights, temperature, security system. I'm in the main house if you need anything, but otherwise consider this your private space." As Hayes departed with a military-precise pivot, Michael exchanged a look with James that communicated their shared suspicion. The colonel's generosity seemed excessive for a casual acquaintance, no matter how strongly he supported veterans' causes. "I'll start unpacking the car," Michael said, the subtext clear. He would also be looking more closely into their host's background. Left alone with Sarah, James eased himself onto the comfortable sofa, fatigue washing over him as the medication continued to work through his system. Max settled at his feet, brown eyes still scanning the unfamiliar environment for potential threats. "You should rest," Sarah advised, her nurse's training evident in her clinical assessment of his condition. "The antivenom can cause drowsiness, and your body needs recovery time." James nodded, lacking the energy to argue. As Sarah helped him to the bedroom, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a hallway mirror. The gaunt face, the rash visible above his collar, the military posture now compromised by pain and fatigue. A shadow of the captain he had once been. The bedroom continued the theme of accessibility and comfort, with a hospital-grade bed that could be adjusted electronically and oxygen equipment discreetly stored in a cabinet. James sank onto the mattress, allowing Sarah to remove his shoes and help him lie back against the pillows. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," she promised, drawing the curtains against the fading daylight. "Try to get some real sleep, James." "You're safe here." As the door closed behind her, James stared at the ceiling, his tactician's mind still turning despite his exhaustion. Colonel Hayes, the perfectly equipped guest house, the convenient timing of their meeting at the Veterans Day ceremony. The pieces suggested a pattern, but one he couldn't yet discern. Max jumped onto the bed, something he was rarely allowed to do at home, and settled beside James, his warm bulk providing both comfort and protection. In the quiet room, with the pain finally receding and the dog's steady presence beside him, James felt his hypervigilance begin to ebb. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured, his hand finding the soft fur behind Max's ears. "Friend or foe?" Max made no response beyond pressing closer, his mission to guard unchanged by their luxurious new surroundings. As sleep finally claimed him, James's last conscious thought was a tactical assessment formed by decades of military experience. When an unknown benefactor appears with exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, the critical question isn't whether to accept the help. It's what price you'll ultimately be asked to pay for it. James awoke to unfamiliar shadows dancing across an unknown ceiling. Disorientation gripped him briefly, a sensation that had triggered violent reactions during his early post-combat years. But the warm weight of Max against his side anchored him to reality, the shepherd's steady breathing a metronomic reminder. Safe, safe, safe. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m. James's head still throbbed, but the crushing intensity had diminished to a dull ache. The rash on his arm burned less fiercely, though when he carefully peeled back his sleeve to examine it, the angry constellation of red remained vivid against his pale skin. Beside him, Max suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward in alert attention. A low growl rumbled in the shepherd's chest, not the aggressive warning from the nights at home, but a sound of cautious assessment. "What is it, boy?" James whispered, instantly alert despite his medicated state. Max's focus fixed on the bedroom door, his posture tense but not alarmed. Moments later, James heard what had captured the dog's attention: quiet footsteps in the hallway, followed by hushed voices. Sarah checking on him, perhaps, or Michael returning from some errand. But Max's continued alertness suggested otherwise. With decades of tactical training still hardwired into his nervous system, James eased himself up and out of bed, careful to minimize noise. His legs felt unsteady, but adrenaline temporarily overrode his weakness. Max stayed close to his side as James moved toward the door, each step deliberate and silent. "Told you this was unnecessary," a voice was saying. Colonel Hayes, his tone carrying the unmistakable cadence of command even in a whisper. "The situation is under control." "With respect, sir," came another male voice, unfamiliar to James. "We have protocols for these situations. The timing is concerning." "The timing is coincidental," Hayes insisted. "Nothing more. I've known Frank Wilson for 40 years. If he says it was an accident, I believe him." The name sent a jolt through James. Dr. Wilson, their neighbor with the insect collection, the one whose shoes Max had found so interesting. What connection did he have to Colonel Hayes? And what accident were they discussing? "Accident or not," the unknown voice replied, "a decorated veteran was exposed to black widow venom in unusual circumstances, and now he's here, in your home. Security protocols dictate—" "I wrote those protocols, son," Hayes interrupted, a dangerous edge entering his voice. "And I'm telling you this is a non-issue. Captain Anderson served with distinction in Vietnam. He's suffering from a spider bite and VA neglect, nothing more. He poses no threat to national security." National security? James's mind raced, trying to connect these fragments into a coherent picture. Why would anyone consider him a threat to national security? "Very well, sir," the other voice conceded reluctantly. "But I'll need to file a full report with the director." "Do what you must," Hayes replied dismissively. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests who need their rest." Footsteps retreated down the hallway, followed by the distant sound of a door closing. James remained frozen in place, processing this strange exchange. After a moment's hesitation, he silently returned to bed, his tactical mind whirring despite his physical exhaustion. Max settled beside him once more, but his vigilance remained heightened, brown eyes fixed on the door as if expecting further intrusions. James stroked the shepherd's fur absently, his thoughts centering on the mysterious connection between Colonel Hayes, Dr. Wilson, and himself, a connection that apparently warranted discussion of national security concerns. Whatever was happening extended far beyond spider bites and a generous offer of accommodation. Something deeper, older, was at play. Something connected to Vietnam, to his service, to the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Sleep eluded him for the remainder of the night, his mind cycling through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Morning brought sunshine streaming through the guest house windows and the aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen. James emerged from the bedroom to find Sarah at the stove, preparing a breakfast that seemed excessive for their temporary quarters. "You're up," she observed, relief evident in her voice. "How are you feeling?" "Better," James replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. The physical symptoms had indeed improved, though his mind remained troubled by the night's overheard conversation. "Where's Michael?" "Colonel Hayes gave him a tour of the property," Sarah explained, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "Apparently there's a workshop out back with a collection of vintage military vehicles. You know how Michael gets around anything with an engine." James nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Max padded in from the bedroom, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. The shepherd paused at the guest house's front window, observing something outside with focused attention. Following Max's gaze, James spotted Colonel Hayes and Michael walking the perimeter of the property, engaged in what appeared to be intense conversation. Hayes's posture was rigid, his gestures clipped and precise, the body language of a man delivering orders rather than making small talk. "How long are we planning to stay here?" James asked casually, testing the waters. Sarah added another pancake to the growing stack. "The fumigation takes 3 days minimum. Hank said he'd call when it's safe to return." She glanced at him, concern evident in her expression. "Dr. Harrington wants you monitored for at least 48 hours anyway. The antivenom can have delayed reactions." James absorbed this information silently, calculating timelines against his growing suspicions. Whatever was happening at Colonel Hayes's property, they were committed to remaining in the middle of it for at least 2 more days. "James," Sarah said hesitantly, setting down her spatula, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you. About Vietnam." The abrupt shift in topic set James's internal alarms ringing. "What about it? Did you ever serve with someone named Frank Wilson, our neighbor?" The question landed like a mortar shell, confirming the connections James had begun to suspect. "Not directly," he answered carefully. "Why do you ask?" Sarah fidgeted with her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "It's probably nothing. But yesterday, after you fell asleep, Colonel Hayes mentioned that he knew Dr. Wilson from their service days. Said they were both stationed near you at some point. Did he specify when or where?" James pressed, his tactical mind fully engaged now. "No, just that it was a small world situation." Sarah returned to her cooking, but her movements had lost their earlier confidence. "Is it important?" "Probably not," James lied, unwilling to burden his sister with his growing concerns. "Just curious about the coincidence." The front door opened before Sarah could respond, admitting Michael and Colonel Hayes. Max immediately moved to James's side, his posture alert but not aggressive. "Captain Anderson," Hayes greeted him with military formality. "Good to see you on your feet. How are the accommodations?" "Exceptional," James replied truthfully. You've thought of everything. Hayes nodded in satisfaction. Medical equipment is regularly updated. Never know when a brother-in-arms might need sanctuary. The word choice, sanctuary rather than shelter or housing, struck James as deliberate, laden with meaning beyond its surface interpretation. I was just telling Michael about my restoration projects, Hayes continued, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Got a '68 Jeep out there that served in the same AO as your unit. The casual reference to James's area of operations in Vietnam was another calculated reveal. Hayes demonstrating knowledge he shouldn't possess through a Veterans Day introduction alone. You seem well informed about my service record, Colonel, James observed, watching the older man's reaction carefully. Hayes's expression remained impassive, but something flickered briefly in his eyes, recognition of the challenge, perhaps, or respect for James's directness. Veterans Administration, he replied smoothly. Part of my foundation's work involves advocating for overlooked cases. I make it my business to know who's falling through the cracks. It was a plausible explanation, but incomplete. James had played enough poker during his military years to recognize when someone was holding cards in reserve. Breakfast is ready, Sarah announced, either oblivious to the tension or deliberately diffusing it. Colonel, will you join us? Another time, perhaps. Hayes declined with practiced courtesy. I have a video conference with the Pentagon in 20 minutes. Military retirement is more theoretical than actual these days. After Hayes departed, the family ate in relative silence, each absorbed in private thoughts. James observed Michael's unusually pensive expression, sensing his brother-in-law had gleaned something significant during his tour with the colonel. The property's quite something, Michael said finally, reaching down to slip Max a piece of bacon. High-end security system, satellite communication setup, even a small medical facility attached to the main house, more like a compound than a retirement home. James nodded, the pieces aligning more clearly. Did the colonel mention how he knows Dr. Wilson? Not specifically, Michael replied, his tone careful. But he did say something odd when we passed Wilson's house on the perimeter tour. Said Wilson keeps his promises even when it costs him everything. Sarah looked up sharply. What does that mean? I don't know, Michael admitted. But I got the impression there's history there, deep history, the kind that binds men together for life. The kind forged in combat, James thought but didn't say. The kind that created debts that could never truly be repaid. Max whined softly, sensing the tension in the room. The shepherd pressed against James's leg, a silent reminder of his protective presence. Whatever mystery surrounded Colonel Hayes and Dr. Wilson, Max remained focused on his self-appointed mission, guarding James from threats, visible or otherwise. I think I'll rest a bit more, James said, rising carefully from the table. The conversation with Hayes had drained his limited energy reserves, and he needed time to process these new developments. The medication still has me groggy. Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Call if you need anything. I'll be right here. In the guest bedroom, James sat on the edge of the mattress, Max settling beside him. The shepherd's warm presence provided comfort, but couldn't dispel the growing certainty that they had stumbled into something far more complex than a spider infestation. Colonel Hayes, Dr. Wilson, national security concerns, Vietnam connections. The coincidences were too numerous, too convenient to be random chance. Something deliberate was unfolding around him, something with roots in a past he'd spent decades trying to leave behind. James reached for his phone, intending to search for information about Hayes and Wilson, only to discover there was no signal in the guest house. No Wi-Fi connection appeared in his settings either, despite the colonel's obvious technological sophistication. Isolation, control of communication, monitoring of movements. The tactical implications were clear and disturbing. They weren't guests. They were contained. And as James stared at the useless device in his hand, another realization struck with chilling clarity. Max's behavior hadn't changed since they'd arrived at the colonel's property. The shepherd remained vigilant, protective, alert to threats, just as he had been in James's bedroom at home. Whatever danger Max had sensed, there hadn't been eliminated by their relocation. It had followed them. Or perhaps they had moved closer to its source. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Michael entered, his expression grave, and closed the door carefully behind him. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we're in trouble, James. Serious trouble." Outside the window, the autumn sun continued to shine with deceptive cheerfulness on the colonel's immaculate property, while inside the shadows of the past grew longer and darker with each passing hour. Michael closed the bedroom door with deliberate care, his movements precise and controlled, the same way he'd once cleared buildings during his K-9 unit days. He gestured for James to remain seated, then methodically checked the windows and air vents before speaking. "I think the room is clean," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't be sure. This whole place feels like a monitoring station disguised as a guest house." James nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. "What did you find?" "While walking the grounds with Hayes, I spotted surveillance cameras covering every approach to the property," Michael explained, sitting beside James on the bed. "Not just standard security, military-grade equipment with thermal imaging capabilities. And there's a secure outbuilding that Hayes forgot to include in the tour." "Armed personnel?" James asked, his mind automatically mapping potential escape routes and threat assessments. "At least 2 that I saw. Civilian clothes, but military bearing, sidearms under their jackets." Michael ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of barely contained anxiety. "But that's not the most concerning part. I got a look at Hayes's study through the window while he was taking a call. There were photos on his wall, old military photos. One of them had you in it." A chill that had nothing to do with his medical condition spread through James's body. "Me? You're certain?" "Younger, of course. Vietnam era. But definitely you, standing with a group of other soldiers. And Dr. Wilson was there too." The revelation confirmed James's growing suspicions while raising a host of new questions. He'd never recognized Wilson from his service days, yet apparently they had crossed paths significantly enough to warrant photographic evidence. "There's more," Michael continued, lowering his voice further. "When I doubled back to use the restroom in the main house, I overheard Hayes on the phone. He said, 'The situation is contained. Anderson doesn't remember, and we're going to keep it that way.'" James absorbed this with outward calm, decades of combat experience allowing him to process threats without visible reaction. Inside, however, his mind raced. Doesn't remember what? "I tried calling Sarah's sister for background on Hayes," Michael added, "but there's no cell service here, and the landline in the kitchen requires some kind of access code to dial out." "We're being contained," James concluded, voicing his earlier realization. "The question is why? What possible threat could I pose to a retired colonel after all these years?" Max, who had been lying quietly beside the bed, suddenly raised his head, ears alert. A moment later, soft footsteps approached the bedroom door, followed by a gentle knock. "James? Michael? Are you guys okay in there?" Sarah's voice was tinged with concern. Michael quickly stood, assuming a casual posture. "We're fine. Just catching up." The door opened to reveal Sarah, her nurse's eyes instantly assessing her brother's condition. "You look pale. Are you feeling worse?" "Just tired," James assured her, though in truth, The conversation with Michael had drained what little energy the anti-venom had restored. The medication makes it hard to focus. Sarah accepted this explanation, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Colonel Hayes just called. He's having some colleagues over for dinner and has invited us to join them. I told him you probably weren't up for socializing, but he was quite insistent. Said one of the guests is a VA administrator who might be able to help with your case. James and Michael exchanged a look, silent communication passing between them. A dinner with Hayes's colleagues presented both risk and opportunity, a chance to gather more information, but in a controlled environment where they would be outnumbered. I'll go, James decided after a moment's consideration. Might as well take advantage of the Colonel's connections while we're here. Sarah's relief was palpable. Great, it's at 7. Nothing formal, he said. She hesitated, glancing at Max. He asked that Max stay in the guest house, though apparently one of his guests has allergies. Another tactical limitation, James noted mentally. Separation from Max would remove both warning system and protection. Of course, he agreed smoothly, not wanting to arouse Sarah's suspicion. Max could use a quiet evening. After Sarah departed to help prepare for the dinner, Michael leaned closer. You sure about this? Walking into Hayes's territory, surrounded by his people? James nodded grimly. Better to engage on terms we can anticipate than wait for them to make the first move. Besides, Sarah's already suspicious. If we start acting paranoid, she'll demand explanations we can't provide. What about Max? They don't know how much we've figured out, James reasoned. Let them think separating us from Max was their idea. But before dinner, we need to find a way to contact the outside world. Someone who can tell us more about Hayes and Wilson. Michael considered this, then smiled slightly. I might have an idea. When I was touring the property with Hayes, I noticed the gardener's shed has a landline, probably for calling suppliers. If I can get out there on some pretext... Do it, James urged. And see if you can find Dave Fletcher's number. He might have insights about Wilson's spider research that could help us understand what's happening. The plan set, Michael departed to implement his part, leaving James alone with Max. The shepherd watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. Looks like we've stepped in it again, boy, James murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. Just like Da Nang in 71. The comparison brought a flood of unbidden memories. Jungle heat, artillery fire, the sickening certainty of walking into an ambush. James had led his men out of that trap through quick thinking and calculated risk. Now, 50 years later, he faced another ambush of sorts, with stakes he didn't yet fully understand. Whatever secret lay buried in his past, Colonel Hayes and Dr. Wilson were determined to keep it there. The question was why, and what they might do to ensure his continued ignorance. The main house gleamed with old money and military precision, antique furniture arranged with mathematical exactitude, historical artifacts displayed in museum-quality cases, everything spotless and perfectly maintained. As Sarah helped James navigate the 3 steps to the formal dining room, he noted the absence of personal touches. No family photos, no evidence of hobbies or interests beyond military service. Colonel Hayes greeted them at the entrance, resplendent in a blazer with subtle military pins on the lapel. Captain Anderson, Mrs. Miller, Mr. Miller, so glad you could join us. The dining room contained 4 other guests, already seated at a massive mahogany table. Hayes made efficient introductions, a retired general named Simmons, a silver-haired woman introduced as Ms. Campbell from the Veterans Administration, a younger man named Roberts who was described vaguely as a consultant, and, most surprisingly, Dr. Frank Wilson. Wilson appeared startled to see James, though he recovered quickly. Captain Anderson, feeling better, I hope? Somewhat, James replied neutrally, studying the entomologist with new awareness. The elderly scientist's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, a detail James might once have attributed to age, but now recognized as nervous tension. Hayes seated James between Miss Campbell and the general, strategically separating him from Michael, who was placed at the far end of the table. Sarah sat beside Dr. Wilson, already engaged in conversation about his insect collection. Ms. Campbell was just telling us about the VA's new expedition program for veterans' claims, Hayes announced, as servers appeared with the first course. Particularly relevant to your situation, Captain. The VA administrator smiled professionally. Colonel Hayes mentioned your case, Captain Anderson. 40 years of service, and still fighting for proper benefits. It's exactly the kind of situation our new initiative aims to address. James nodded politely, though internally he questioned the coincidence. After decades of VA bureaucracy, a solution suddenly appeared at a dinner with people connected to his mysterious past. "I'd be interested to hear more," he said, maintaining the facade of grateful veteran, "though I've learned not to expect miracles from government agencies." General Simmons chuckled appreciatively. "Spoken like a true soldier. Government promises and government delivery rarely align." The conversation flowed with practiced ease, touching on military history, current VA policies, and the challenges facing aging veterans. On the surface, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a gathering of military and administrative personnel discussing veterans' affairs. Yet James detected currents beneath the pleasant exchange. Meaningful glances between Hayes and Wilson, the consultant Roberts saying almost nothing while observing everything, the general's carefully modulated questions about James's memory of specific operations in Vietnam. "Did your unit ever operate near the Cambodian border, Captain?" Simmons asked casually over the main course. "I seem to recall some special reconnaissance missions in that region during your tour." James maintained his neutral expression, though the question raised internal alarms. "My unit had standard patrol duties throughout the Central Highlands. Nothing special about our assignments." "Of course," the general replied smoothly. "Memory plays tricks after so many years." As dinner progressed, James noted Michael's restlessness, subtle shifts in posture, glances toward the window, checking his watch. Their earlier plan to access the gardener's shed telephone had evidently encountered obstacles. When dessert was served, Hayes steered the conversation toward James's recent spider encounter. "Dr. Wilson tells me black widows are particularly prevalent in Virginia this year. Quite fortunate that your dog detected them before more serious harm occurred." Wilson nodded nervously. "Yes, quite fortunate. German Shepherds have extraordinary sensory capabilities." Speaking of which, the consultant Roberts interjected his first substantial contribution to the conversation. "I understand Max was a military-trained service dog before being discharged for behavioral issues?" Michael's head snapped up. "Who told you that?" Roberts smiled blandly. "Colonel Hayes mentioned it. I work with veteran service animal programs occasionally, always interested in the training methodologies." The explanation seemed reasonable, yet James detected an undercurrent of specific interest in Max that aligned with their growing suspicions. The dinner wasn't just about him, they were equally concerned about his dog. "Max was discharged for being too protective," Michael explained, his tone carefully controlled. "Military wanted a dog that would follow commands even if his handler was in danger. Max chose his handler's safety over mission parameters. Loyalty over duty," General Simmons mused. "A complex ethical calculus, even for humans." As coffee was served, James noticed Sarah stifling a yawn, an unusual display given her typical social stamina. His own eyelids felt unexpectedly heavy despite having rested most of the day. Across the table, Michael blinked repeatedly, as if struggling to maintain focus. With sudden clarity, James recognized the symptoms. They were being drugged. The coffee, the food, perhaps both. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I'm feeling rather tired. Would you mind if we return to the guest house?" Hayes intervened smoothly. "Actually, Captain, I was hoping you might join me in my study after dinner. There's something there I believe would interest you greatly. A piece of history we share." The invitation, more command than request, confirmed James's suspicions. Whatever game was being played had reached its final moves. Refusing would alert Hayes that they were on to him. Accepting would separate James from Sarah and Michael, potentially making him more vulnerable, but it would also provide answers. "I'd be honored, Colonel," James replied, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "History has always been a passion of mine, particularly the parts that others prefer to forget." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or concern, crossed Hayes's face before his expression returned to practiced affability. "Excellent. Mrs. Miller, Mr. Miller, please feel free to return to the guest house if you're tired. These old war stories would only bore you anyway." As Sarah and Michael reluctantly departed, James noted the consultant Roberts following them out, ostensibly to escort them safely, but more likely to ensure they returned directly to the guest house. Alone with Hayes, Wilson, Simmons, and the VA administrator whose credentials James increasingly doubted, he felt the weight of unknown history settling around him like a shroud. "Shall we, Captain?" Hayes gestured toward a door at the far end of the dining room. "The past awaits." James rose with deliberate dignity, refusing to show weakness despite his medical condition and growing certainty of danger. Whatever truth lay in Hayes's study, he would face it as he had faced every threat since Vietnam, with tactical awareness, strategic patience, and the absolute conviction that surrender was never an option. As he followed Hayes from the room, James cast one last glance toward the guest house where Max remained. The shepherd had sensed danger from the beginning, had tried to warn them all. Now, separated from his protector, James would have to rely on his own instincts to navigate whatever revelation awaited him. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. And judging by the extraordinary measures Hayes and his associates had taken, it was a past far more dangerous than black widow spiders in bedroom walls. Colonel Hayes's study embodied military precision. Bookshelves arranged by subject and height, medals displayed in chronological order, furniture positioned for optimal movement and conversation. The room smelled of leather, old books, and the faint citrus notes of gun oil. As James entered, he automatically catalogued potential weapons: letter opener on desk, heavy brass bookends, exits, door, 2 windows, and vantage points, desk positioned to view both door and windows simultaneously. "Please sit." Hayes gestured to a leather armchair positioned before an antique desk. "Can I offer you a drink? Scotch, perhaps? Medicinal, of course." A thin smile accompanied this last remark. "No, thank you," James replied, lowering himself carefully into the chair, his body still weakened by venom and medication. "I believe I've been medicated enough this evening." Hayes paused in the act of reaching for a crystal decanter, a flicker of genuine amusement crossing his weathered features. "Perceptive as ever, Captain. Nothing harmful, I assure you. Just a mild sedative to ensure your family rests well tonight. This conversation is best had without interruptions." Dr. Wilson entered silently, closing the door behind him with nervous precision. The entomologist looked even more strained up close, his complexion ashen, hands perpetually trembling. Without waiting for invitation, he took the chair furthest from James, as if proximity itself might prove dangerous. "Frank here has carried a burden for over 40 years, Hayes said, settling behind his desk with tumbler in hand. "Tonight, we hope to finally set things right." James studied Wilson with renewed attention. The elderly scientist avoided direct eye contact, fingers absently tracing patterns on his pant leg, the gestural equivalent of a whispered confession. "We've met before," James stated rather than asked. "In Vietnam." Wilson nodded, the movement barely perceptible. "Yes, though you wouldn't remember. Because of the spider venom? Or something else entirely?" James kept his tone neutral, but the accusation hung in the air between them. Hayes intervened smoothly. "Perhaps we should start at the beginning." He opened a desk drawer and removed a faded photograph, sliding it across the polished surface toward James. "Does this image mean anything to you?" The photograph showed a group of young soldiers posed before a military helicopter, faces squinting against tropical sun, uniforms darkened with sweat. James recognized himself immediately, younger, harder, standing slightly apart from the others with the habitual vigilance of command. Wilson appeared too, almost unrecognizable without 4 decades of aging, a gangly specialist with thick glasses and an uncertain smile. "Operation Stillwater," Hayes provided when James remained silent. "May 1972. A classified reconnaissance mission along the Cambodian border. Your platoon, 3 intelligence officers and a scientific advisor, Dr. Wilson." The names meant nothing to James, triggered no memories, yet something about the photograph unsettled him deeply, a wrongness he couldn't articulate, like a word forgotten at the edge of consciousness. "I don't recall this mission," he admitted finally. "No," Hayes confirmed. "You wouldn't. After what happened, certain. Measures were taken to ensure operational security." The implication settled like ice in James's stomach. "You tampered with my memories." It wasn't a question, but Hayes nodded anyway. Different era, different protocols. The mission encountered complications that were deemed too sensitive for regular documentation. All participants underwent memory suppression, a combination of psychological techniques and pharmacological interventions available at the time. "Except some of you remember," James observed coldly, looking between Hayes and Wilson. "Command level was exempted," Hayes explained without apology, and Dr. Wilson's unique expertise made his continued awareness necessary. James's tactical mind processed this information, fitting it into the emerging pattern. "And now, something's happening that makes my forgotten knowledge dangerous again. The spider bite, Max's behavior, your convenient appearance at the Veterans Day ceremony. None of it coincidental." Wilson spoke up, his voice thin but steady. "The spider was my fault. A genuine accident. One of my specimens escaped while I was extracting venom for my research. But when I realized it had found its way to your home..." He trailed off, unable to maintain eye contact. "You didn't report it," James finished for him. "You let me get bitten repeatedly." "Why?" "Because," Hayes interjected, "the particular neurotoxin in black widow venom has an interesting side effect in certain individuals, especially those previously subjected to memory suppression techniques. It can cause breakthrough memories, fragments of recollection that were supposed to remain buried." James leaned forward, ignoring the protesting ache in his joints. "You've been watching me for 40 years, waiting to see if I'd remember something I'm not supposed to know." "Not watching," Wilson corrected softly. "Protecting. There's a difference." "Is there?" James's voice hardened. "You moved across the street from my sister's house, exposed me to venomous spiders, and now you've isolated my family in a surveilled compound. All to protect me?" Hayes set down his glass with deliberate care. "Not just you, Captain. Your family, the country. Sometimes protection requires containment." "Of what?" James demanded, patience fraying. "What exactly happened on this mission that justifies 40 years of surveillance and manipulation?" The 2 older men exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing silently between them. Finally, Hayes nodded and Wilson reached into his jacket, removing a small yellowed envelope. Your letter, Wilson said, placing it on the desk between them. The one you wrote the night before we left Firebase Conroy? James stared at the envelope, his name visible in younger handwriting on the front, a letter to himself he had no memory of writing. We weren't supposed to be there, Wilson continued, words spilling out as if a dam had broken. The intelligence was wrong, so wrong. The village wasn't hostile. They were refugees, mostly women and children. But the airstrike had already been called in, coordinates locked. Your radio operator was killed by a sniper, Hayes added clinically. Communications equipment destroyed. No way to call off the strike. Wilson's hands shook violently now. You ordered us to evacuate the village, against direct commands to maintain position and await extraction. You chose those people over your orders. The narrative continued between them, pieces of a puzzle James couldn't yet see in full. The extraction team arrived just as the first bombs fell, Hayes said. Found you pulling children from burning huts, Wilson administering medical aid. 3 of your men were already dead covering the evacuation. I counted the survivors, Wilson whispered. 73 civilians. You saved 73 lives that day. James felt a pressure building behind his eyes. Not memory exactly, but the ghost of it. Shadows moving behind a curtain he couldn't part. If I saved them, why erase it? He asked, voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. Why hide an act of humanity? Hayes's expression darkened. Because the airstrike wasn't supposed to exist. The entire operation violated neutrality agreements with Cambodia. Internationally, we denied all cross-border activities. The mission couldn't exist on paper, and witnesses couldn't be allowed to remember, especially not an American officer who directly contravened orders. They were going to court-martial you, Wilson added quietly, until I intervened. James turned to the scientist, confusion evident. You? What influence could a specialist possibly have over military justice? Wilson smiled thinly. I wasn't just any specialist. I led the Chemical Weapons Research Division, specifically the Entomological Applications Program. My work was valuable to certain government interests. I leveraged that value to save you from prosecution. In exchange for your silence, James concluded, the pieces aligning with brutal clarity. And your memory, Hayes confirmed. The alternative was dishonorable discharge, possibly prison. This way, you received an honorable discharge, kept your benefits, limited though they've been, and continued your life. James absorbed this, the tactical analyst in him recognizing the cold logic even as the man rejected the fundamental violation. And you've been watching ever since, making sure the memory suppression held. Not just watching, Wilson corrected again, more forcefully this time. I promised your father I'd look after you. After what happened to him in Korea, saving my life. The statement landed like a physical blow. My father? What does he have to do with this? Wilson looked stricken, glancing at Hayes as if seeking permission or guidance. The colonel nodded grimly. Thomas Anderson pulled me from a burning transport in '53, Wilson explained, voice thick with emotion. Suffered third-degree burns over 40% of his body. He didn't survive the evacuation. I know how my father died, James said sharply. What I don't know is why you never mentioned this connection before now. The debt, Wilson said simply. I owed him everything. When I discovered his son was the officer who saved those villagers, who faced court-martial for an act of humanity, I couldn't stand by. Protecting you became my life's work. James struggled to process this cascade of revelations, each more disorienting than the last. His forgotten heroism, his father's connection to Wilson, 40 years of surveillance disguised as protection. The spider venom, he said finally, returning to the present crisis. You think it's restoring my memories? Hayes nodded. Early indicators suggest breakthrough recollection. Your increased interest in Vietnam memorabilia, according to your sister, nightmares about jungle operations, villages burning, the questions you've been asking at the VA about classified missions. This was news to James. I haven't been asking about classified missions. A heavy silence fell over the room. Hayes and Wilson exchanged another significant look. You called the Pentagon Records Division 3 times last month, Hayes said carefully. Requested declassification review of Operation Stillwater documentation. James shook his head firmly. No, I did not. We have the recordings, Captain, Hayes insisted. Your voice, your service number, your personal details. The implications sent a chill through James. Either his memory loss extended far beyond a single mission in 1972, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to impersonate him, to deliberately trigger the very surveillance system that had now ensnared him. Someone wants you to think I'm remembering, he said slowly, mind racing through scenarios. Someone who knows about the operation, the memory suppression, all of it. Someone setting me up. Hayes's expression remained skeptical, but Wilson leaned forward with sudden intensity. The spider, he said urgently. It wasn't just any specimen that escaped. It was one I'd specially bred for venom potency, part of my continuing research into neurological applications. Someone tampered with the containment unit. I assumed it was my own error, but if what you're saying is true, then none of this is coincidence, James finished grimly. The spider, the VA inquiries, my family's isolation here were all being manipulated as part of someone else's operation. The tactical possibilities unfurled in his mind with familiar clarity. A third party with knowledge of classified operations, access to Wilson's research, resources to orchestrate elaborate scenarios. Your dog, Hayes said suddenly, as if reading James's thoughts. The timing of his alerts began precisely when the spider venom would have reached systemic circulation in your bloodstream. Not before, not after. Max was trained in chemical detection before Michael adopted him, James recalled. Dave Fletcher confirmed it. Wilson's scientific mind engaged visibly, decades of research crystallizing into hypothesis. If the spider's venom was modified beyond my original formulation, it might produce a signature that a highly trained detection dog would recognize, especially one with military chemical weapons training. Max wasn't warning me about spiders, James realized with dawning clarity. He was alerting to whatever compound is in my system, the same compound that might be designed to reverse the memory suppression. Hayes rose abruptly, military decisiveness replacing diplomatic caution. We need to secure the premises immediately. If someone is targeting you, targeting this operation, we're all compromised. As if summoned by his words, a distant alarm began to sound from somewhere on the property. Hayes moved to his desk, pressing a concealed button that illuminated a small security monitor. Perimeter breach, he announced tersely. Southeast quadrant. Wilson paled visibly. The guest house. James was already moving, decades of combat command overriding his physical limitations. Sarah and Michael. Max. Hayes reached for the telephone on his desk, but before he could lift the receiver, the study door burst open. The consultant Roberts stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, breathing heavily. Sir, he gasped, addressing Hayes with military formality despite his civilian attire. We have a situation. The dog. A familiar bark echoed down the hallway, followed by shouting and the sound of breaking glass. James recognized that bark, not Max's protective growl or playful woof, but his attack command used only in situations of imminent threat. What have you done? James demanded, rounding on Hayes with sudden fury. If your people have harmed my family, it's not us, Hayes insisted, drawing a concealed sidearm from his desk drawer. Whoever set this in motion has made their move." He handed the weapon to James without hesitation. 40 years ago, you disobeyed orders to save innocent lives. I'm counting on that same moral compass now." James accepted the pistol automatically, muscle memory engaging as he checked the chamber in safety. The weight felt familiar in his hand, too familiar, as if decades of civilian life had temporarily evaporated. Another alarm joined the first, this one more urgent. Roberts's radio crackled with panicked voices reporting multiple breaches, communications failure, armed intruders on the grounds. "Extraction protocol," Hayes ordered Roberts crisply. "Secure Dr. Wilson and prep for immediate departure." "And my family?" James demanded, positioning himself between Hayes and the door. "Find them," Hayes said simply. "Get them out. We'll rendezvous at the secondary location in 24 hours. Before James could respond, the lights throughout the house flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. In that crimson illumination, James made his choice. The same choice he had apparently made 4 decades earlier in a burning village on the Cambodian border. He would protect the innocent, regardless of orders, regardless of cost. "Wilson," he said sharply, "with me. We're getting my family out, now." The elderly scientist nodded, years of guilt and secret keeping giving way to simple human connection. "Yes, Captain." As they moved into the hallway, Max's barking grew louder, more frantic. The sound pulled at James with primal urgency. His protector calling for aid, warning of danger, guiding him through chaos once again. Whatever truth lay buried in his past, whatever conspiracy had brought them to this moment, one thing remained certain. He would not abandon his family to the machinations of old wars and older secrets. Not again. Not ever. When life tests our strength, we discover who truly stands beside us. James Anderson's story reminds us that loyalty comes in many forms. Sometimes from family who never give up on us, sometimes from brothers in arms who keep decades-old promises, and sometimes from a faithful German shepherd who sees dangers we cannot. For many of us who faced our own battles with health, bureaucracy, or feeling forgotten after years of service, this resonates deeply. We understand what it means to fight for dignity while carrying invisible wounds. But James's journey shows us that we're never truly alone. There are people fighting for us, even when we don't realize it, and sometimes our greatest protector has 4 paws and unwavering devotion. Have you ever had someone in your life, person or pet, who saw what others missed and protected you when you needed it most? Or perhaps you've been that guardian angel for someone else? Share your story of unexpected protection in the comments below. We'd love to hear how loyalty has shaped your journey, just as Max's devotion changed everything for Captain Anderson.